Hi, hello friends, good morning. Welcome to the Course 6 revision series. I'm Dr. Sumna. Today you'll be learning PSM with me, okay? So first, we'll revise the epidemiology and biostatistics part. So moving on to the first question on screen. So the epidemiological study with population as a unit of study. So which is the epidemiological study with population as a unit of study? The options are ecological study, cohort study, case control study and experimental study. Okay, so the answer for this question is yes, it is ecological study. See, in ecological study, the unit of first study is population, whereas in the other studies, your cohort study, your case control or your RCTs, that is experimental studies, the unit of study is always a individual or subjects. So what is this ecological study? See, for any study design, basically what they do is we have an exposure, we have an outcome, right? So we try to find a relation between this exposure and the outcome. But in ecological studies, you try to find out the relation between the exposure in population and what is the relation of that to outcome in population. It's not in single individuals. For example, here's an example of an ecological study. What they did is they compared the chocolate consumption with the number of Nobel Prize winners within countries. Okay, so it was found that among all the countries, Switzerland had the highest number of chocolate consumption as well as they had the highest number of Nobel Prize winners. So that was the inference they made. But there is an issue with this study design. Okay, suppose this guy who's a Nobel Prize winner from Switzerland, if you ask him, maybe he might not be eating chocolate, right? So that is whatever you have inferred may not be correct in case of individuals, but it might be correct in case of population. This difference or this issue is called ecological fallacy. Remember this term, ecological fallacy. That is an issue in ecological studies. And one more point is ecological studies cannot be used to establish causality. Why we just discussed the reason, right? So now we'll just revise what are the study designs. How do you classify study designs? You have observational, you have experimental, right? Under observational, again, you have descriptive, analytical. Under experimental, you have randomized control trials and non-randomized. We'll just write it down. So your study designs, you classify them as observational and experimental. What is the basic difference? In experimental, the investigator, or if I am investigating, I intervene and I give an intervention there. Okay, I'm doing an experiment there. Whereas in observational studies, I'm not doing anything. It's the nature that is doing. Whatever is happening, you're just observing and then you come at inferences. Okay, so you have observational, experimental. Under observational, you have descriptive studies and analytical studies. Under experimental, you have two types, that is randomized trials and non-randomized. Now, under descriptive, again, what are these studies which are descriptive? You have your case report, case series, then ecological study, and cross-sectional studies. These are all descriptive studies, okay? And under analytical, you have your case control study, cohort study, again, cross-sectional studies. See friends, cross-sectional study can be either descriptive or analytical. For example, if I'm finding out just the burden of a disease, okay, I'm finding out the burden of hypertension alone. If that is my study, it's a descriptive cross-sectional study. But suppose I want to find out the burden as well as the factors associated with it. Or I'm trying to find out whether this hypertension prevalence is more in females or males. So if something like that comes in, then it becomes an analytical study, okay? So under analytical, mainly you have case control and cohort studies. Now another question is, among the study design, which one is used in hypothesis formation, which one is used in hypothesis testing, and which one is used in hypothesis confirmation? So for hypothesis formation, you use descriptive studies. To test your hypothesis, whether whatever your hypothesis is true or not, for that you make use of your analytical studies or the case control and the cohort studies. For hypothesis confirmation, you have to go for experimental studies or RCTs mainly. So I hope that is clear. Now we'll move on to the next question. So you'll be given a scenario and you'll be asked to find out which is the best study design used for this, or identify the study design. Okay. So the question is, 20 pregnant women were asked about the history of smoking when they came for regular antenatal visit, and then followed up to see how many of them had low birth weight babies. So what is the type of study design used? The options are case control, cohort, cross-sectional, and ecological study. Okay. So if such a question comes, first you define what is the exposure, what is the outcome, and what is the direction. Okay. So in this example, what is the exposure? It is the smoking, right? Smoking history in mothers or ANC mothers is the exposure. And what is the outcome? You're seeing for low birth weight babies, whether smoking in the pregnancy time led to birth of a baby with low birth weight. That is what you're going to find out. And they have said that you are following them up. So this term, this is actually a keyword. If there is a followed up, that means it's a cohort study, right? So the answer here is prospective cohort. So we'll see in detail. So when there is an exposure, you start with risk factors and those without risk factors, and then you follow up the group for a long time, and then you find out the outcome. Such a study is a cohort study. Suppose this was a case control study. How would have they asked the question? Suppose if I'm taking babies with low birth weight, and I have who are the cases, and I have a control group with normal birth weight, and then I go backward and I take the history from the mothers, whether they were having smoking while they were pregnant. So if I start from a cases and control, that is deceased and non-deceased, and if I go back and then I search for the exposure, then it becomes a case control study. Here it is from the smoking, that is a risk factor, and without risk factor you have, then you follow them up, and then you find out for the outcome, which is low birth weight and normal birth weight. So this kind of a study is a cohort study. And when you get questions like this, you see the word here, followed up. Follow up is in it, which one? Cohort study. And ecological study doesn't come in play at all, right? Because ecological study is for population. You cannot take this. So the answer here is the prospective cohort study. So again, just the same thing. So mainly, this is where you go wrong. You have cohort studies and case control studies. So in cohort studies, you start with exposed and non-exposed, okay? And then this is how the investigator goes, okay? And then you follow them up and you see how many of them developed disease in the exposed group and how many of them developed the disease or the outcome in the non-exposed group. And in such a study, you get the incidence, okay? You get all the risk incidence, then you get the relative risk, then you have attributable risk, you have population attributable risk. All these risks you get in a cohort study. For a case control study, you start with cases. What do you mean by cases? Whom do you call a case? Case is always a deceased person, right? So in case control studies, always the study should start with the deceased and controls who do not have the disease. So you have deceased and non-deceased. Then you go back in time and then you compare their exposures, whether this particular risk factor was present in the control and in the cases. So that is how we do a case control study. So now, cohort studies, we have three different types of cohort studies, which are the retrospective cohort, prospective cohort, and ambispective cohort. So always remember, in cohort studies, you always go from the risk factor to outcome. There should be no confusion in this. In prospective studies, just see this part. You have retrospective and prospective studies explained in this diagram. So in retrospective studies, see the risk factor and the outcome has already occurred. You are starting a study here. But then you go back and you see for the risk factor, it is two groups with the risk factor, one group, and the other group without the risk factor. And then you see for the disease outcome. The direction is always from risk factor to outcome, but both the risk factor and outcome has already occurred. This type of a cohort study is called retrospective cohort, also known as non-concurrent cohort. Okay. Next type is prospective cohort. That is a simple one. You're starting here, both the risk factor and your outcome has not occurred. So you're going to, first you'll follow up people with risk factor, no risk factor, and then you follow up them up and you find out for the outcome. So here, both have not occurred. So this is a prospective cohort. Now there is a prospective cohort is also known as what? Concurrent cohort. There is one more type of cohort, that is the mixed cohort or the ambispective cohort. Here, you're somewhere here, okay? You have risk factor, present minus, and you go for outcome. And the investigator is somewhere here, okay? Suppose this is 2008, this is 2010, and 2009. So I'm doing my study in 2009, but the risk factors already occurred in 2008. Outcome has not occurred. Outcome is going to occur. So I'm in between the risk factor and the outcome. This kind of a study is called a mixed cohort or a ambispective cohort. Okay. So now you know the study designs and type of cohort studies. Now moving on to the next question. Okay. 30,000 large cohort is followed up for 10 years. Then 50 cases developed and rest controls have been taken. What kind of study design is it? So what do you have here? You have a big cohort going on, right? You have a big cohort of 30,000 people, which you are following up for 10 years. That study is going on. So in between that study, that is within that cohort, you're doing a second study or a case control study within that cohort. This kind of study is called a nested case control. Okay. So we'll just see what it is. So you have a big cohort study going on. Okay, this being happening. Okay, so in between this cohort, if you take some cases and some controls and you try to embed a case control study within the cohort study, that makes up another study. Okay, so there are studies which are embedded within the cohort study. You have two types of studies which you should remember. One is your nested case control and another one is case cohort studies. So we'll see each one. So here the answer is nested case control study. So in nested case control, you have a defined cohort. So in cohort, you're following up certain people, right? So they have the risk factor and you're seeing whether they are developing a disease or an outcome. So in between while you're following up, some people will develop the disease, some people will not develop the disease, some will take more time. So in a nested case control study, what you're doing is, suppose this is my cohort and one person developed a disease. I take him as case 1 and then I take a control similar to him but without the disease. So I take a control 1 here. Then another person developed the disease, that is case 2. Simultaneously I take a control group. And then you get cases 3 and 4. For them also I take controls, that is control 3 and 4. Then case 5, control 5. Okay. So like this, within the ongoing cohort, I get cases and controls and I do a case control study within that cohort. This type of study design is called nested case control study. So there is something else called a case cohort study. This is also very similar to a nested case control study, but there are few differences, okay? In a case cohort study, again, this is also embedded within the cohort. So you have a defined cohort and you get some cases, okay? Case 1, case 2, case 3, case 4, case 5. Those who develop the disease, these are the cases. But instead of taking, control group simultaneously, that is when I develop case 1, I'm not taking control then and there. But I wait, and after all the cases I've developed, then I select 5 controls. Okay, here I have 5 cases. So once my sample size I've attained, suppose it's 5. So if I got 5 cases and then at a time I just select 5 controls for these cases and then I do a case control study, then that becomes a case cohort study. Okay, so 2 types of case control studies which are embedded within a cohort are nested case control and the case cohort study. So now, going on to the next question. So this question involves some calculations, okay? Basically, they are going to ask you the calculate the association. That is, in case control study, you have to calculate the odds ratio. In cohort studies, you have to calculate the risk. Can be relative risk, attributable risk, population attributable risk. So this is a similar question to that. Okay, what is the question? So a study was carried out to find out safety of OCPs. Relative risk or odds ratio of thromboembolism among OCP users to non-users in the given case control studies. So they've given a case control study. So what was done? You have OCP users and risk of thromboembolism. Okay, so your cases are those having thromboembolism and your controls will be those without thromboembolism. Okay, and you're saying for the OCP use in them. Okay, so you are asked to calculate the odds ratio in this question. So when you're asked to calculate odds ratio or relative risk or whatever, the first step is you have to make a 2 by 2 table. And you should not go wrong in the table, because once the table is made, then your calculation is quite easy, okay? So you see there's a table here, okay? They've already given a 2 by 2 table, but this is not the 2 by 2 table that you want, okay? You have to convert the data given here into your 2 by 2 table. We'll see that. So in any 2 by 2 table, this is how you make it. So the disease should come here, okay? This is the people with the disease should come here. These are the people without the disease. And this side, you get your exposure and your those without the exposure. This is the basic format of the 2 by 2 table. Now your work is to fill in this. So what they have given, you have cases of thromboembolism, that is 84 cases of thromboembolism. That is, you have total 84 persons who are deceased. So 84 is the coming here, okay? And then you have 168 people who are not deceased or who are controls. So that is here. The question is, out of the 84 cases of thromboembolism, 50% have used OCPs, okay? So what is the number of people who were exposed to the OCP? That is 50% of 84, which is 42. So here obviously it is those who are not exposed, but they got the disease. Here it is 84 minus 42, again 42. So in the other group, that is in the control group, you had total of 168 individuals. Out of them, 14% have used OCPs. So here you should come 24, that is 14% of 168, and the rest it is 144, okay? So your main job is done. You have filled the 2 by 2 table. This should be this column is always disease, those without the disease here, exposure present, exposure absent, fill up the table. And how do you calculate the odds ratio? Odds ratio is also known as cross product ratio, right? Or AD by BC. Okay, you just do the cross product. So in this case, your odds ratio becomes 42 into 144 divided by 42 into 24, which comes to 6. Okay, so in this question, your answer is 6. 6 is the odds ratio in this question. Okay, so I hope that is clear. So when you're asked to find out the odds ratio, make the 2 by 2 table first and then do the cross product ratio. Okay, so the next question, it is in a population of 9,000, 2,100 were alcoholic, then 70 alcoholics among this developed cirrhosis and 23 non-alcoholic people developed cirrhosis. What is the attributable risk? So they've asked for attributable risk, and what is the study design they're asking about? It's a cohort study, right? You had a big population, out of them a major chunk, that is 2,500 were alcoholic, and the rest of them were non-alcoholic, and then you're following up them, and then you see who developed cirrhosis, whether it is more in the those who had the risk factor or those who did not have, whether it's in the cohort group or the other group. Okay, so here they have asked you to find out the attributable risk. So again, just like the odds ratio, here also when you are asked to find out the any risk, can be relative risk, attributable risk, population attributable risk, best thing is first make the 2 by 2 table so that you don't go wrong. Okay, so here the outcome in this 2 by 2 table, in case control study you had diseased and non-diseased. Here you have the outcome present and outcome absent, right? So this is the outcome present, here you write. Those without the outcome you write here. This side you have the exposure present and this side you have the exposure absent. Okay, this is just A, B, C, D. I'm just writing it down for the convenience of the formula. And what is relative risk? The question is attributable risk, I know, but we'll see what is relative risk and how do you calculate attributable risk and what is population attributable risk also in this single question. Okay, so relative risk is incidence in the exposed by incidence in the non-exposed, right? So what is the incidence in the exposed and what is the incidence in the non-exposed? Incidence in the exposed you get by A plus B, right? This is A. This is the out of the exposure, you have this much people who had the outcome, okay? Outcome incidence of the disease in A, and then A plus B is the total exposed. And incidence in the non-exposed is how much? C by C plus D. The C by C plus D is the incidence in the non-exposed. So when you ask to find out the relative risk, it is incidence in the exposed by incidence in the non-exposed. So you get it like A by A plus B divided by C by C plus D is the relative risk. Okay. So if I get that, suppose the relative risk is 3, then I can say that, how do you interpret it? There is a 3 times more risk of developing cirrhosis in alcoholics than compared to those who don't take alcohol. Okay. Now the question here is, they've asked for the attributable risk. So attributable risk you get by, that is actually the subtraction. You get incidence in exposed minus incidence in non-exposed, give you the attributable risk. When they ask you the attributable risk proportion, it becomes incidence in exposed minus incidence in non-exposed divided by incidence in exposed. So basically what attributable risk is telling you is, see, if I get an attributable risk of 30%, that means among the exposed people, the 30% of this disease is due to their exposure, that is due to the alcoholism. Suppose that in that case you are comparing in the exposed only. But if it's a population attributable risk, then you take incidence in the whole population minus incidence in the non-exposed divided by incidence in the population. So in attributable risk, you say this much of the risk can be avoided in the exposed people if this particular this is avoided. But in population attributable risk, you're considering not just the exposed, but also the non-exposed person. So if I get a population attributable risk of 70% in smoking causing lung cancer, that means if I remove the smoking factor, then I can prevent almost 70% of the incidence of lung cancer in this whole population. Okay, so population attributable risk is more important for your policy makers rather than your relative risk or attributable risk. So coming to the calculation here, what is the calculation? We have been asked to find out the attributable risk, right? So we have incidence in exposed minus incidence in non-exposed by incidence in exposed, and the incidence in exposed becomes, here when you give the values, this is coming to 70, this is 23. The total here they have told exposure is seen in 2,100 people, that those are alcoholic. The total population was 9,000. So those without the exposure is 6,900. Okay. So this is your A, this is your A plus B, this is your C, this is your C plus D. Okay. So when you give the formula, you get the answer to 90%. Okay. This is the attributable risk in this given question. Now, another concept, you should know what is number needed to treat and number needed to harm, and what is attributable risk as well as what is absolute risk reduction. So first we'll see what is attributable risk and absolute risk reduction. Okay. See, attributable risk, you know, that is the risk that is attributed to this particular exposure, right? That is usually you say attributable risk in terms of harmful exposure. Okay. Risk in terms of harmful exposure is the attributable risk. Whereas absolute risk reduction, calculation, everything is almost same as your attributable risk, but absolute risk reduction, you're reducing, right? So absolute risk reduction is said in terms of beneficial exposure. And you have 1 by attributable risk gives you the number needed to harm, and 1 by absolute risk reduction gives you the number needed to treat. Sometimes you might be given questions and instead of asking the attributable risk, they might ask you to calculate the number needed to harm, or if it's a beneficial exposure, you might be asked to calculate the number needed to treat. Okay. So the formula is number needed to harm is 1 by attributable risk, whereas number needed to treat is 1 by absolute risk reduction. So how do you remember this? So I have a mnemonic for you. Who is this? ARR, right? A.R. Rahman. So you agree that his music is always beneficial, and you know music is used as a treatment or therapy, right? So remember it like this. So ARR's music is beneficial as a therapy. So ARR for absolute risk reduction, ARR is always beneficial. So comes the beneficial one, and it is needed for treatment, or you can say it is related to number needed to treat. A.R. Rahman cannot do harm. He can only do good or treatment side. So number needed to treat is related to ARR, and again it is for beneficial exposure. Okay. So what is this number needed to treat? So now you know it is 1 by ARR, right? So in simple words, you do it in case of, for example, in an RCT, where you're trying whether you're trying a better drug or a beneficial drug than what is existing. So if I get a number needed to treat is 4 for a particular drug, how do you interpret it? That means it is the number of patients you have to treat to prevent the additional bad outcome. Suppose if I'm saying to prevent stroke in hypertensive patients, I've developed a new drug and the number needed to treat is 4. That means at least 4 persons I have to treat so that I can prevent a stroke outcome in 1 person. Okay, that is the simple concept of number needed to treat. So remember, absolute risk reduction or ARR is related to number needed to treat. 1 by ARR is number needed to treat. Whereas the other one is AR or attributable risk is related to number needed to harm. This 1 by AR is the number needed to harm. Remember, ARR, beneficial, music therapy or treatment. Okay. Now coming to the next question. So here you have a cohort study undertaken to study the association between green tea intake and diabetes mellitus. The relative risk they've already given, you don't have to calculate. It is 0.85. What is correct regarding association between green tea and diabetes mellitus? So basically, they've given the study design, they've given the relative risk. You are asked to interpret. This is a neetpg last year question. Okay, so the options are green tea consumption increases the risk of diabetes, green tea consumption decreases the risk, green tea consumption has no effect and cannot be determined. So how do you interpret the risk? Either relative risk or odds ratio. Okay. See, when the risk is less than 1, that means there is a negative association and your exposure is protective. This you get in case of, for example, in vaccines. Vaccines is an exposure, right? You're giving it so that you can prevent the disease or you can prevent the outcome. So most in vaccines and all, you get relative risk less than 1, which is beneficial or protective. And if the relative risk is more than 1, that means there is a positive association and it is harmful. You have a higher risk. And if it is equal to 1, that means there is no relation. Okay, there is no risk. So in this question, you have less than 1, right? 0.85 is the relative risk given with regard to green tea consumption and diabetes mellitus. So in this case, you can say green tea consumption decreases the risk of diabetes mellitus. Option B is the correct answer.